A millionaire humiliates his elderly housekeeper and fires her the same day. When he finds out who she really was, he is stunned. Before the story begins, comment below which city you're watching this video from. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Enjoy the story, everyone. The towering glass and limestone facade of the Whitmore Hotel caught the morning light, casting a golden glow across Beacon Street. From the outside, the hotel was a postcard of luxury and architectural elegance. From the inside, it was a well-oiled machine that functioned with meticulous precision under the watchful eye of its owner, James Whitmore. James adjusted his custom-tailored Armani suit as he strode through the gleaming marble lobby. At 45, he cut an impressive figure, tall with salt and pepper hair that only enhanced his authoritative presence. His steel blue eyes missed nothing, scanning every corner of his domain for imperfections. The Whitmore was not just a hotel, it was a reflection of himself, immaculate, prestigious, and uncompromising. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," the front desk staff called out in practiced unison, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes. James acknowledged them with a curt nod. He didn't believe in excessive pleasantries. Respect was earned through excellence, not friendliness. Besides, they weren't truly smiling at him, they were smiling at the paycheck he provided. That arrangement suited him just fine. "Harrison," James called to his hotel manager, who materialized at his side almost instantly. "I'll be conducting room inspections on the executive floors today. Have the housekeeping supervisor meet me on the 12th floor in 10 minutes. "Yes, sir. Right away, sir." Harrison tapped rapidly on his tablet, his fingers moving with the nervous energy of someone who knew that a single misstep could cost him his position. As James rode the private elevator to the 12th floor, he reflected on the morning's call with his financial advisor. The Whitmore Hotel's profits had increased by 17% over the previous quarter. His ruthless attention to detail was paying off, just as it always had. The memories of his climb to success flickered through his mind. The elite business school education funded by his father's money, the strategic acquisitions, the competitors he'd outmaneuvered. Richard and Eleanor Whitmore had raised him to understand that excellence wasn't just expected, it was the bare minimum. Whitmore men build legacies, his father had repeated throughout his childhood. Now James owned the most prestigious hotel in Boston, with 2 more under construction in Chicago and San Francisco. The elevator doors slid open to reveal Sophia Chen, the housekeeping supervisor, standing at attention in her pressed uniform. Her face was a mask of professional composure, but James noted the slight tension in her shoulders. "Mr. Whitmore, the 12th floor is prepared for your inspection. We've implemented all the new protocols you requested last month." "We'll see," James replied, stepping out of the elevator. "Show me room 1214 first." The inspection began methodically. James ran his finger along door frames, checking for dust, inspected bathroom fixtures for water spots, and examined the alignment of every decorative pillow. He made notes on his phone, occasionally delivering curt assessments that made Sophia flinch. "The turned-down chocolates are placed 2 inches from the edge of the nightstand, not 1.5 as specified in the manual," he noted, in room 1218, his voice cold. "I apologize, Mr. Whitmore. I'll address that immediately with the staff. See that you do. These details matter, Ms. Chen. They're what separate the Whitmore from every other luxury hotel claiming to offer excellence." They continued down the hall, room after room, with James finding minute flaws that would be invisible to most observers, but were glaring deficiencies to him. By the time they reached room 1232, Sophia's professional demeanor was beginning to crack under the relentless criticism. As they entered, an elderly housekeeper was finishing up, tucking in the last corner of a pristine white duvet. She straightened quickly when the door opened, smoothing her uniform with weathered hands. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore, Ms. Chen," she said with a warm smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. Unlike the front desk staff, her warmth seemed genuine. James recognized her as Margaret Benson, one of the hotel's longest-serving employees. She'd been there since before he'd taken over the property from his father. Something about her had always made him vaguely uncomfortable. Perhaps it was the maternal way she spoke to everyone, regardless of their position. In James's view, such familiarity was unprofessional. "Ms. Benson," he acknowledged briefly before turning his attention to the room. His inspection was even more thorough than usual, perhaps because he sensed Sophia's growing discomfort. He checked inside drawers, under the bed, behind the curtains. When he stepped into the bathroom, his expression darkened. "Ms. Chen, Ms. Benson, come here, please." Both women entered the bathroom, where James was pointing to a barely visible water spot on the chrome faucet. "Can either of you explain this?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Margaret stepped forward. "I apologize, Mr. Whitmore. I must have missed that during my final check. I'll take care of it right away." James turned to her, his gaze ice cold. "Ms. Benson, how long have you worked at the Whitmore?" 22 years this May, sir," she replied, her dignity intact despite his towering presence. 22 years, he repeated. "And in those 22 years, have the standards for bathroom cleanliness changed?" "No, sir. The Whitmore has always maintained the highest standards." "Then perhaps you can explain why, after 22 years, you are unable to properly clean a bathroom faucet?" His voice remained level, but it cut like a knife. Margaret straightened her shoulders. "There's no excuse, Mr. Whitmore. It's my responsibility to ensure every detail is perfect." Something in her composed response, her refusal to cower, irritated James further. He continued his inspection with growing scrutiny, finding additional minor issues: a crooked lampshade, a remote control that wasn't perfectly centered on the coffee table. "Ms. Chen," he finally said, turning to the supervisor, "what we have here is a perfect example of complacency. When employees have been here too long, they become blind to the standards that make the Whitmore exceptional." He turned to Margaret, who stood with quiet dignity. "Ms. Benson, your long service to this hotel is appreciated. However, it's clear that you're no longer able to maintain the level of excellence our guests expect and deserve." Sophia's eyes widened. "Mr. Whitmore, if I could just—" "I've made my decision," James cut her off. "Ms. Benson, you'll be given a severance package in accordance with your years of service. Please clear out your locker and complete the necessary paperwork with HR before the end of the day." The color drained from Margaret's face, but she maintained her composure. "I understand, Mr. Whitmore." "Good. That will be all." James turned back to his notes, effectively dismissing both women. As they left the room, James caught a glimpse of Sophia placing a comforting hand on Margaret's shoulder. He felt a momentary twinge of something. Not quite regret. He'd made the right business decision after all. Perhaps it was simply recognition that another remnant of his father's era at the hotel was now gone. By lunchtime, James had forgotten about Margaret Benson. He was deep in conference calls about the Chicago property, focused on the future of the Whitmore empire. The present and the past were merely stepping stones to greater achievements. At least that's what he believed, until Margaret Benson would return to the Whitmore Hotel the next day, carrying with her a truth that would shatter the carefully constructed foundation of James Whitmore's identity. Margaret Reynolds, known professionally as Margaret Benson for reasons she kept to herself, sat on the edge of her bed in her modest apartment in Dorchester. The severance check lay beside her, untouched. After 22 years of service, of waking at 4:30 a.m. to catch 2 buses to Beacon Street, of scrubbing and polishing and perfecting, it had ended with a cold dismissal over a water spot. But it wasn't the dismissal itself that made her hands tremble as she reached for the worn leather box she kept on her nightstand. It was knowing who had delivered it. The box creaked open to reveal yellowed newspaper clippings, a hospital bracelet, and a single photograph. A newborn baby with a distinct crescent-shaped birthmark at the base of his neck. Margaret's weathered fingers traced the outline of the infant's face in the photograph. James, her James. 22 years ago, she hadn't taken the housekeeping job at the Whitmore by accident. She'd recognized the name instantly. Richard and Eleanor Whitmore, the wealthy couple who had adopted her son 45 years earlier. She had wanted only to glimpse the life he had, to know from a distance that her sacrifice had given him the opportunities she never could have provided. She had never intended to reveal herself. What good would it do? James had grown up with every advantage, becoming a successful businessman. He didn't need an aging woman from Dorchester claiming to be his mother. Besides, she had signed away her rights, promised never to interfere. The Whitmores had been explicit about their terms. But something had changed yesterday. Perhaps it was the dismissive way he had looked through her rather than at her. Perhaps it was knowing she would never again have even that tenuous connection to him. Or perhaps at 70, Margaret was simply tired of carrying her secret alone. "It's time," she whispered to the empty room, tucking the photograph and a folded document into her purse. The next morning, Margaret dressed carefully in her Sunday best, a navy blue dress with a modest pearl necklace she'd saved for years to purchase. She applied a light touch of makeup and styled her silver hair neatly. If this was to be their first true meeting as mother and son, she wanted to present herself with dignity. The Whitmore Hotel's lobby was bustling with the morning rush of business travelers and tourists when Margaret walked through the revolving door. Several staff members did double takes, surprised to see her back so soon after her dismissal. A few approached with sympathetic smiles. "Miss Benson, what are you doing here?" asked Tina, a young front desk clerk who had often sought Margaret's advice. "I need to speak with Mr. Whitmore," Margaret replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Is he in this morning?" Tina glanced nervously toward the executive offices. "He is, but he's in a foul mood. The Chicago contractor called with more delays." She lowered her voice. "Are you sure this is a good time?" Margaret smiled gently. "There's never a perfect time for some conversations, dear." As she made her way to the executive elevator, Harrison, the hotel manager, intercepted her with a concerned expression. "Margaret, I was going to call you." "About yesterday?" "It's all right, Harrison. I'm not here to make a scene or beg for my job back. I just need a few minutes with Mr. Whitmore." Harrison hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and the respect he had for the long-time employee. "He doesn't like unscheduled interruptions." "I know, but this can't wait." There was something in Margaret's tone, a quiet certainty, that made Harrison step aside. "Fifth floor. His assistant will try to stop you, but—" He shrugged helplessly. "Thank you, Harrison." The executive floor was a world away from the service corridors Margaret had traversed for over 2 decades. Thick carpeting muffled her footsteps as she approached a sleek desk where a young woman with perfectly styled hair guarded access to James Whitmore's office. "Excuse me," the assistant said, rising immediately. "This area is restricted to authorized personnel only." Margaret straightened her shoulders. "My name is Margaret Benson. I need to speak with Mr. Whitmore." The assistant's eyes flickered with recognition. "I'm sorry, Ms. Benson, but Mr. Whitmore is extremely busy today. If you'd like to leave a message, please tell him it's regarding a personal matter." Margaret's voice remained gentle but firm. "A family matter." The confusion on the assistant's face was evident, but something in Margaret's unwavering gaze prompted her to reach for the intercom. "Mr. Whitmore, I apologize for the interruption, but there's a Margaret Benson here to see you. She says it's regarding a family matter." There was a long pause before James's voice came through the speaker, cold and clipped. "Tell Ms. Benson that if she's here to dispute her termination, she should direct her concerns to human resources, not fabricate personal connections." Margaret stepped forward. "Please tell Mr. Whitmore that I know about the crescent-shaped birthmark at the base of his neck, the one shaped like a half-moon." The assistant's eyes widened, but she dutifully relayed the message. This time, the silence from the intercom stretched even longer. Finally, the door to James's office swung open, and he stood there, his expression an unreadable mask. "5 minutes, Ms. Benson," he said tersely, gesturing her inside. James's office was immaculate, all clean lines, modern furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of Boston Harbor. He did not invite her to sit, instead positioning himself behind his imposing desk. "I assume this is some kind of attempt at wrongful termination leverage," he began, his tone dismissive. "Let me save us both time. Your severance package is generous by industry standards, and your termination was fully within the bounds of Massachusetts employment law." Margaret remained standing, her hands folded calmly before her. "I'm not here about the job, James." "Mr. Whitmore," he corrected automatically. "No," she said softly. "To you, I'm Margaret. But to me, you will always be James, my son." James stared at her, his expression shifting from irritation to disbelief. "Excuse me?" Margaret opened her purse and removed the photograph, sliding it across the desk. "You were born on April 17, 1980, at Boston Medical Center. You had a crescent-shaped birthmark at the base of your neck. You still do, though you keep it covered with high-collared shirts." She placed the document beside the photograph. "This is a copy of the adoption papers I signed 6 days later." James didn't reach for either item. His face had hardened into a mask of controlled anger. "This is absurd, and frankly, disturbing. My parents are Richard and Eleanor Whitmore. Your adoptive parents," Margaret corrected gently. "They gave you everything I couldn't, the best schools, opportunities, this hotel. I was 19, alone, and working 2 jobs. I wanted more for you than I could provide. This is some kind of scam, James said, though a flicker of uncertainty had entered his eyes. He finally picked up the photograph, studying it with clinical detachment. This could be any baby. Check the hospital name and date on the back, Margaret said quietly. Then look at the adoption papers. Your parents' signatures are there, along with mine. Margaret Reynolds. Reynolds? James looked up sharply. My maiden name. I changed it to Benson after I lost you. It was too painful to keep hearing it. James set the photograph down with deliberate care, his businessman's mind searching for logical explanations. Even if these documents aren't forgeries, which remains to be seen, why would you wait 45 years? Why take a job here? Why reveal yourself now? Margaret's composure faltered for the first time. I never intended to tell you. The adoption agreement stipulated no contact. But when Richard stepped down and you took over the hotel, I just wanted to see what had become of you, to know you from a distance. She smiled sadly. You were so accomplished, so successful. I was proud, even if I couldn't say it. And now? James's voice had a dangerous edge. Now that I've fired you, suddenly you're my long-lost mother? That's remarkably convenient timing, Ms. Benson or Reynolds or whatever your name really is. I understand your skepticism, Margaret replied, maintaining her dignity despite his cutting tone. But yesterday, when you dismissed me, I realized I might never see you again. At my age, she shook her head. I couldn't bear taking this secret to my grave. You deserve to know the truth, even if you never want to see me again afterward. James's jaw tightened. He reached for his phone. This meeting is over. I'll have security escort you out. Ask them, Margaret said simply. Ask Richard and Eleanor about April 1980. Ask them about the adoption, about the agreement they made with a desperate young woman from Dorchester. She reached into her purse one last time and placed a business card on the desk. This is my phone number. Whether you believe me now or not, you'll want to talk again after you speak with them. For a brief moment, something vulnerable flashed across James's face. A glimpse of the uncertain little boy who had always strived for his father's approval, who had always felt he needed to earn his place in the Whitmore legacy. Then the mask slammed back into place. Security will be here momentarily, he said, his finger hovering over the intercom. Margaret nodded and turned to leave. At the door, she paused. You have your father's eyes, you know. Not Richard's, your biological father's, the same intense blue. She smiled sadly. But you have my determination. I see it every day in the way you pursue perfection. She left before security arrived, her head held high as she walked through the lobby one last time. Several employees watched her go, confused by her brief return. Only Harrison noticed the tears she quickly brushed away as she pushed through the revolving door and stepped out into the spring sunshine. Back in his office, James stared at the items on his desk. The photograph, the documents, the business card, with a Dorchester phone number. His hand moved to the base of his neck, fingers tracing the outline of a crescent-shaped birthmark hidden beneath his collar. Ridiculous, he muttered, sweeping everything into his desk drawer and slamming it shut. He had meetings to attend, decisions to make, a hotel empire to run. He had no time for delusions or schemes. Yet as he turned to his computer, James found himself opening his contacts and hovering over his father's number, a call he would ultimately make, setting in motion a revelation that would unravel the very foundation of his carefully controlled world. James sat in his Aston Martin outside his parents' Beacon Hill brownstone, engine off, keys still in the ignition. The evening light cast long shadows across the cobblestone street, and behind perfectly manicured window boxes, lamps began to glow in neighboring homes. He'd been sitting there for nearly 20 minutes, something unprecedented for a man who scheduled his life in 15-minute increments. After Margaret had left his office, James had tried to dismiss her claims as the desperate fabrications of a disgruntled employee, yet something had kept him from calling security. Something had made him lock those documents in his desk drawer rather than throwing them away. That something had eventually driven him to call Richard Whitmore's private line at precisely 4:30 p.m. James, his father had answered, warm but formal as always. This is unexpected. I need to see you and Mother tonight. James had kept his voice level despite the turmoil beneath. A pause. Is everything all right, son? I'll explain when I arrive. 7 o'clock. Now, as the antique grandfather clock inside chimed 7 times, James finally stepped out of his car and approached the home where he'd grown up. A home characterized by quiet elegance, rigid expectations, and a peculiar emotional distance he'd never questioned until today. Eleanor Whitmore answered the door herself, dismissing the housekeeper with a graceful wave. At 72, she remained striking, tall and slender, with silver hair swept into an immaculate chignon, pearls at her throat. "James, darling," she said, accepting his perfunctory kiss on her cheek. "This is a pleasant surprise. You usually call days in advance." "Is father in the study?" James asked, bypassing pleasantries as he stepped into the marble foyer. Eleanor's smile faltered slightly. "Yes, with his bourbon, as always at this hour. James, is something wrong at the hotel?" "The hotel is fine," he replied, already moving toward the study. Richard Whitmore rose as James entered, a reflexive courtesy ingrained by generations of Boston aristocracy. At 75, he still cut an imposing figure, though he'd softened somewhat around the middle since retiring from active management of the Whitmore properties. "James," he said, gesturing to the leather chair opposite his own, "your mother is bringing in some of that cheese you like. What brings you by on a Wednesday?" James remained standing. "I had a visitor at my office today, Margaret Benson, or rather, Margaret Reynolds." The crystal tumbler in Richard's hand froze halfway to his lips. A nearly imperceptible glance passed between Richard and Eleanor, who had appeared in the doorway. "The name is familiar," Richard said carefully. "One of your housekeeping staff, isn't she?" "She was," James replied, watching his parents intently, "until I fired her yesterday. She returned today with an interesting story and some documents with your signatures on them." Eleanor moved to her husband's side, her hand finding his shoulder in a gesture of support. "Perhaps you should sit down, James." "I don't want to sit down," James said, his voice suddenly sharp. "I want to know if it's true. Am I adopted?" The silence that filled the book-lined study was deafening. Richard set his tumbler down with a heavy clink against the mahogany side table. "Yes," he said finally, his voice steady but resigned. "You are." The confirmation hit James with physical force, though he'd been half expecting it since seeing that fleeting look between his parents. He sank into the chair, his legs suddenly unable to support him. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question emerged as barely more than a whisper. Eleanor moved to the small bar cart in the corner, pouring amber liquid into a tumbler identical to Richard's. She brought it to James, her hand trembling slightly. "We always meant to," she said, her composure cracking for perhaps the first time in James's memory. "When you were young, the right moment never seemed to come. Then as you grew older, it seemed unnecessary. You were our son in every way that mattered." "In every way except the truth," James said coldly, accepting the drink but not taking a sip. "Were you ever going to tell me? Or were you hoping Margaret Reynolds would keep her part of whatever bargain you struck and stay silent forever?" Richard leaned forward, his face grave. "What exactly did she tell you?" "That she was 19, alone. That she gave me up for adoption in April 1980. That you made her promise never to contact me." James's hand unconsciously moved to the back of his neck. "She knew about my birthmark." Richard and Eleanor exchanged another look, this one longer, laden with decades of shared secrets. "Yes," Richard finally said, "those are the facts. Eleanor and I had been trying for years to have a child. The doctors finally told us it wasn't possible. We were devastated." For a moment, raw emotion broke through his patrician reserve. "Then our lawyer told us about a young woman, educated, healthy, from a good family that had fallen on hard times, who couldn't keep her baby. We met her," Eleanor added softly. "Just once. She was so young but so determined that her child would have opportunities she couldn't provide. We promised to give you everything. The best education, a secure future, our name." "Your name," James repeated, the words suddenly strange on his tongue. "But not your blood, not your legacy. All those times you told me that Whitmore men built empires, that excellence was in our DNA, those were lies." Richard stiffened. "I never lied about what matters, James. I raised you, I taught you, I gave you values, principles, opportunities. What's in your blood is far less important than what's in your character." "And what exactly is in my blood?" James demanded, finally taking a swallow of bourbon, welcoming its burn. "Who was my father? Another penniless teenager. We don't know, Eleanor admitted. Margaret never told us. It wasn't part of our arrangement. James gave a bitter laugh. Your arrangement? Tell me, how much did you pay her? What's the market rate for a human being in 1980? That's unfair, James, Richard said sharply. We provided financial assistance, yes, medical care, living expenses during her recovery, but this wasn't a transaction. It was a chance for all of us, you most of all, to have a better life. A life built on lies, James countered. A life built on love, Eleanor insisted, tears now flowing freely down her carefully made-up face. We couldn't have loved you more if I had carried you myself. You are our son, James, our only child, our greatest joy. Something in her naked emotion penetrated James's anger. He looked at the woman who had read to him every night, who had attended every school function, who had taught him to tie a perfect Windsor knot. He looked at the man who had patiently explained compound interest when he was 10, who had trusted him with increasing responsibility in the family business, who had stood beside him at the grand opening of the renovated Whitmore Hotel. Why did she come back? James asked, his voice hollow. Why take a job at the hotel? Was she watching me all this time? Richard sighed heavily. The agreement was no contact, but we never specified she couldn't be near you. Perhaps, he hesitated, perhaps a mother's need to know her child is well can't be entirely erased with a signature on legal documents. James stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked Beacon Hill, the neighborhood where he'd ridden his first bicycle, attended his first society function, brought his first girlfriend to meet his parents. His life had been privileged, protected, perfect in its way, and suddenly, fundamentally altered. She said, I have her determination, he said quietly, more to himself than to his parents, that I have my biological father's eyes. Behind him, he heard Eleanor's sharp intake of breath. You do, she admitted softly. The first time I held you, I was struck by those intense blue eyes, so serious even as a baby, always watching, assessing. James turned back to face them. I fired her, my own mother. I humiliated her in front of her colleagues over a water spot on a faucet, and I didn't even know who she was. You couldn't have known, Richard said reasonably. But you did, James shot back. You knew she worked there. You must have recognized her when you still ran the hotel. Richard's expression confirmed it. Yes, she applied shortly after I took over operations. I allowed it. She was qualified, and it seemed harmless as long as she maintained our agreement. I thought perhaps it gave her some peace to see that you were thriving. Peace, James repeated bitterly, while scrubbing toilets in the hotel her son owned, while being berated by him for imperfections. He drained his glass in one swallow. What kind of man does that make me? A man who didn't know, Eleanor said gently. A man who can now choose what to do with this knowledge. James set his empty glass down with a decisive click. I need to go. Richard stood. Son, please, stay. Let's talk this through. I've had enough revelations for one night. James's voice was ice, his face a mask of control that had become second nature over the years. I need time to process this. Eleanor reached for him, but James stepped back. I'm not angry at you, he said, his tone belying the statement. But I need space right now. Neither Richard nor Eleanor tried to stop him as he strode from the study and through the foyer. As the front door closed behind him with a solid thud, Eleanor's composure finally broke entirely. She sank onto the leather sofa, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Richard sat beside her, taking her hand in his. He'll come back, he said, with more confidence than he felt. He just needs time. Outside, James sat in his car again, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His carefully ordered world had been upended in the space of a single day. Everything he thought he knew about himself, his identity, his place in the world, even the source of his drive for perfection, was suddenly in question. He thought of Margaret Reynolds, returning to the hotel not to beg for her job, but to tell her son the truth, even knowing he might reject her. The courage that must have taken, the years of silence she had endured. James started the engine with a savage twist of the key. He had decisions to make, a truth to face. But first, he needed to drive, fast and far, away from the familiar streets of Boston where nothing seemed familiar anymore. As his car disappeared into the night, James couldn't know that across the city, in her modest Dorchester apartment, Margaret sat by the phone waiting for a call she wasn't sure would ever come. 3 days passed before James called the number on Margaret's card. 3 days of sleepless nights and distracted days, of snapping at his staff and staring out his office window at the Boston skyline. 3 days of questioning every aspect of his identity and examining memories from his childhood with new, critical eyes. He'd noticed things he'd never paid attention to before. How there were no baby pictures of him with Eleanor before he was 6 days old. How conversations about family medical history had always been redirected. How Richard had emphasized the Whitmore name and legacy with almost obsessive frequency. When he finally made the call, it was from his car, parked along the Charles River just after dawn. James had always done his clearest thinking in the early morning hours, away from the demands of the hotel. Margaret answered on the third ring, her voice thick with sleep. "Hello? It's James Whitmore," he said formally, as if this were a business call. "You were right, about everything." There was a pause, then a rustling sound as she presumably sat up in bed. "I'm glad you called," she said simply. "I'm not sure why I did," James replied with uncharacteristic honesty. "I'm still processing all of this." "That's understandable," Margaret said. "It's a lot to take in. I spoke with Richard and Eleanor. They confirmed the adoption. They said they always meant to tell me." "I believe they did," Margaret said, surprising him with her generosity. "Making that decision and then finding the right moment to share it, I imagine it grew more difficult with time." James frowned at her understanding tone. "They lied to me my entire life. And you watched me from a distance for over 20 years without saying anything." "Yes," Margaret acknowledged, offering no excuses. "Would you like to meet to talk about it? Properly, I mean." James hesitated. Part of him wanted to say no, to retreat to the emotional distance that had served him well in business. Another part, a part he rarely acknowledged, needed answers only she could provide. "The public garden," he said finally. "By the swan boats." 1 hour. He ended the call without waiting for a response, a habit from his business dealings that suddenly felt inappropriate for a conversation with his mother. The word still felt foreign, impossible to connect to the silver-haired housekeeper he'd dismissed so callously. An hour later, James sat on a bench near the lagoon, watching early morning joggers and dog walkers circling the garden paths. The spring air was crisp, cherry blossoms just beginning to peek from their buds. In his tailored suit, he stood out among the casual morning crowd. When Margaret arrived, she too had dressed carefully, not in the navy dress from their last meeting, but in simple beige slacks and a light blue cardigan. More comfortable, but still dignified. She carried a small paper bag. James stood as she approached, a reflexive courtesy that surprised them both. They regarded each other awkwardly before Margaret gestured to the bench. "May I?" she asked. James nodded stiffly, sitting down beside her with a careful distance between them. For a long moment neither spoke, both watching a pair of the garden's famous swans glide across the water. "I used to bring you here," Margaret finally said, "before the adoption. I was only pregnant for a few months during warm weather, but I'd come and sit right here, talk to you." She smiled at the memory. "Told you how the swan boats had been running since 1877, how the public garden was the first public botanical garden in America." James glanced at her, his expression guarded. "You sound like a tour guide." "I was for a summer in college," Margaret replied, "before I had to drop out." "Because of me," James said, a statement rather than a question. Margaret turned to face him fully. "Because of circumstances, James, not because of you. Never because of you." "Tell me about those circumstances," he said, his tone softening almost imperceptibly. Margaret looked down at her hands, workers' hands, with prominent veins and knuckles slightly swollen from decades of manual labor. "I was studying education at Boston University, first in my family to go to college. My parents had passed away in a car accident my senior year of high school, but I had scholarships, a part-time job. I was making it work." She paused, glancing at James to see if he wanted her to continue. His slight nod encouraged her. "I met your biological father in my sophomore year. He was charismatic, ambitious, from a wealthy family. When I got pregnant, he made it clear that a baby wasn't in his plans. His family offered money to end the pregnancy. But you didn't take it," James observed. "No. By then I'd heard your heartbeat, seen you on a grainy ultrasound. You were real to me." Margaret's voice grew distant with memory. His family cut him off for a while and he blamed me. He left Boston before you were born, went to law school out west. Last I heard, he became quite successful. Do I know him? James asked, suddenly alert. Is he in Boston now? Margaret shook her head. He never came back. And no, I won't tell you his name. He made his choice, and whatever kind of man he became, he's not part of this story. James wanted to press further, but recognized the finality in her tone. So you were alone, in college. Pregnant? Yes. I tried to keep up with classes, but morning sickness was terrible. I lost my scholarship when my grades slipped, had to drop out, get a full-time job waitressing, then a second job at night cleaning offices. She shrugged. It still wasn't enough. The medical bills, the rent. I was facing eviction when you were born. James had never known financial insecurity in his life. The concept of being unable to pay rent was as foreign to him as the surface of Mars. Yet something in her matter-of-fact recounting touched him. There was no self-pity, no attempt to make him feel guilty. So you found the Whitmores, he prompted. Not exactly. My doctor connected me with an adoption attorney. He knew of a couple who'd been trying for years to have a child. Successful, stable, desperate for a baby. Margaret smiled sadly. I met with them once. Eleanor was so elegant, so kind. Richard was formal but sincere. They promised to give you everything I couldn't. And the conditions? The secrecy? Margaret opened the paper bag she'd brought, pulling out a bottle of water. She took a small sip before answering. They wanted a clean break. No confusion about who your parents were. They feared I might change my mind, disrupt your life. She offered James the second water bottle from the bag. They weren't being cruel. They were protecting their family, protecting you. James accepted the water, their fingers briefly touching in the exchange. Did you ever regret it? Giving me up? Margaret's eyes grew damp. I regretted the necessity of it every day of my life. But regret the decision? No. Look at you, James. Harvard Business School, a successful entrepreneur. You've built something remarkable. Her voice softened. You would have had none of that with me. You don't know that, James countered, surprising himself with the response. I do know. I couldn't even keep my apartment. For the first few years after the adoption, I lived in a women's shelter, then a series of rooms in shared houses. It took me a decade to get an apartment of my own again. She looked out over the lagoon. You deserved better than that struggle. James was silent, turning the water bottle in his hands. The weight of her sacrifice settled on him, not just the pregnancy and birth, but the decades of silence that followed. The daily proximity at the hotel, watching him grow into a man who didn't know her, couldn't acknowledge her. Why did you stay at the hotel all those years? He finally asked. At first, just to glimpse you occasionally. Richard would bring you by when you were small. Then as you grew older and started working summers there, I just wanted to know you were well, to see what kind of man you were becoming. Margaret hesitated. Later, it became home in a way. I had friends among the staff. It was steady work, good benefits. And then I fired you, James said, the shame of it washing over him anew. You fired an employee who didn't meet your standards, Margaret corrected. You didn't fire your mother. You didn't know. Her absolution only made James feel worse. I was cruel, unnecessarily so. For the first time, Margaret's expression hardened slightly. Yes, you were. Not just to me, but to many of the staff. That part has been difficult to watch. The criticism, gentle as it was, struck James more powerfully than any business negotiation or boardroom confrontation ever had. It was the first truly maternal thing she'd said to him. An honest assessment delivered with the unique combination of love and disappointment that only a parent could convey. I'm not, he began, then stopped, uncertain how to defend himself, or if he even should. You're not your father, Margaret said quietly. Either of them. You're James. You get to decide what kind of man you want to be. The simplicity of her statement cut through the tangled emotions of the past few days. James looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just the housekeeper he'd dismissed or the young mother who'd given him up, but a woman of remarkable resilience and dignity. I'd like to hear more, he said finally. About you. About before. He gestured vaguely, encompassing the years before his adoption and the decades after. Margaret's smile was like the spring sunshine breaking through morning clouds. "I'd like that very much." As they sat talking on the bench beside the swan boats, their conversation tentative but gradually warming, neither noticed Harrison, the hotel manager, jogging along a nearby path. He slowed, doing a double take at the sight of his fearsome boss, engaged in what appeared to be a pleasant conversation with the recently fired housekeeper. Harrison quickly changed direction, giving them privacy while wondering what on earth could be happening. Whatever it was, the usually grim-faced James Whitmore looked different somehow. Less rigid, more human. It was a transformation that would soon extend beyond a private conversation in the public garden to the very heart of how James ran his hotel and lived his life. The weeks following James and Margaret's meeting in the public garden brought changes that rippled through the Whitmore Hotel like subtle tremors preceding a seismic shift. It began with small things. James arriving at the morning management meeting with coffee for everyone, not just himself. A good morning offered to the doorman with actual eye contact. A moment taken to ask Harrison about his daughter's college applications. The staff exchanged puzzled glances behind his back. A few whispered theories circulated. A new relationship perhaps, or medication, or possibly a near brushes with his own mortality. None guessed the truth, that James Whitmore was slowly, painfully examining his life through the lens of a new understanding of himself. He and Margaret had begun meeting regularly, first at neutral locations like cafes or the Esplanade along the Charles River, then eventually at her modest apartment in Dorchester. Each visit revealed another layer of the story he'd never known. His mother's struggles after the adoption, her eventual return to night school to earn an associate's degree in hospitality management, her quiet pride in seeing the hotel thrive under Richard's leadership and later his own. She showed him photographs she'd kept hidden for decades, herself as a young student at Boston University, radiant despite her expanding belly. A grainy ultrasound image with Baby Reynolds typed across the top. A tiny hospital bracelet she'd removed from his wrist before handing him over to the Whitmores. "I knew it was wrong to take it," she admitted, holding the yellowed plastic band gently. "But I needed something to hold on to." In turn, James found himself sharing stories from his childhood, summer sailing lessons on the Cape, the science fair project Richard had helped him build in 4th grade, the pride he'd felt when Eleanor had hung his Harvard diploma in the most prominent spot in their Beacon Hill study. "They were good parents," Margaret had said with genuine warmth. "They gave you everything I hoped they would." "Almost everything," James had replied quietly. Not the truth. Now, a month after Margaret's revelation, James sat in his office reviewing quarterly projections when Harrison knocked on his open door, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Mr. Whitmore, do you have a moment?" James gestured to the chair across from his desk. "What is it, Harrison?" The hotel manager fidgeted with his tablet. "It's about the employee satisfaction survey results. They've come in early." "And?" James prompted, noticing Harrison's discomfort. "Well, sir, historically we've had challenges in certain areas. Staff morale, retention intentions, confidence in leadership." James leaned back in his chair. A month ago, he would have dismissed such concerns as irrelevant sentimentality. The hotel was profitable. Employee feelings were secondary at best. But Margaret's words from their third meeting echoed in his mind. A hotel is like a living organism. The guests only see the polished surface, but it's the heart underneath that keeps everything running. "Show me the results, Harrison. All of them." Harrison passed over his tablet, and James scrolled through page after page of concerning statistics. Only 37% of staff felt valued. Less than half believed management cared about their well-being. Over 60% were actively considering other employment opportunities. "This is," James began, then paused, choosing his words carefully. "This is not acceptable." Harrison braced himself for the explosion that would normally follow such results. Instead, James set the tablet down and asked, "What do you think is the root cause?" Harrison blinked, thrown by the question. "Sir, you work more closely with the staff than I do. What's driving these numbers?" Harrison hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Honestly, sir? Fear. The staff performs out of fear rather than commitment. They're afraid of making mistakes, afraid of being humiliated, afraid of losing their jobs over minor issues. Like a water spot on a faucet," James murmured. "Exactly like that, sir. The Margaret Benson situation. It sent shockwaves through the staff. Someone with over 20 years of dedicated service dismissed so publicly. It reinforced the feeling that no one is truly secure here, no matter how loyal or hard-working. James felt a pang of shame so acute it was almost physical. He'd built a culture of fear, just as his adoptive father had before him. Excellence through intimidation rather than inspiration. Thank you for your honesty, Harrison. I'd like you to schedule an all-staff meeting for tomorrow morning. Multiple sessions to accommodate all shifts. Harrison looked alarmed. All staff, sir? That's over 200 people. I'm aware of how many people work in my hotel, Harrison. James's tone was sharp, but he caught himself. Sorry. Yes, all staff. And I'd like you to reach out to Margaret Benson. Ask her if she would be willing to attend the 10 a.m. session. Harrison's eyebrows shot up. Ms. Benson, the housekeeper you... Yes, that Margaret Benson. Tell her it's important to me, but make it clear it's an invitation, not an obligation. After Harrison left, James sat motionless behind his desk, contemplating the decision he was about to make. He'd spent his entire adult life building walls between himself and his employees, between his professional persona and his private self, between his emotions and his actions. Those walls had made him wealthy and successful by conventional metrics, but they'd also made him lonely, feared rather than respected. Margaret had shown him a different way to exist in the world, with dignity but also kindness, with standards but also forgiveness. The next morning, James stood at the front of the hotel's largest conference room, facing the assembled day shift staff. Front desk agents, concierges, housekeepers, maintenance workers, kitchen staff, all watching him with wary expressions. In the back row, he spotted Margaret, who gave him an encouraging nod. Thank you all for being here, he began, setting aside the note cards he'd prepared. I've asked you to gather because I owe you an apology. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Several employees exchanged glances, certain they'd misheard. For years, I've operated under the belief that excellence can only be achieved through rigid standards and harsh consequences. I pushed you to deliver perfection by making you fear failure. James paused, making eye contact with several long-time employees. I was wrong. The silence in the room was absolute now. Every face turned to him in disbelief. The Whitmore Hotel has always prided itself on luxury and attention to detail. Those standards will not change. What will change, effective immediately, is how we work together to achieve them. James stepped out from behind the podium, a symbolic gesture that wasn't lost on the assembled staff. I want to build a hotel where employees feel valued for their contributions, where mistakes are learning opportunities rather than causes for humiliation, where we all take pride in our work because we're part of something meaningful, not because we're afraid. As he continued outlining his vision for a transformed workplace culture, James noticed tears in the eyes of several veteran staff members. Others remained skeptical, arms crossed defensively. Change wouldn't come overnight. Trust, once broken, couldn't be repaired with a single speech. Finally, James said, I want to acknowledge a specific mistake I made recently. He looked directly at Margaret. Many of you know that Margaret Benson, one of our most dedicated housekeepers, was terminated last month for what I deemed substandard work. That decision was not only unjust, but revealed serious flaws in my leadership. James took a deep breath. Ms. Benson, if you're willing, I'd like to formally offer you reinstatement to your position with full back pay and benefits, and a public apology for my actions. The room erupted in murmurs as Margaret stood slowly. She made her way to the front, every eye following her progress. When she reached James, she smiled gently. Thank you for the offer, Mr. Whitmore. I accept your apology wholeheartedly. She turned slightly to address both James and the staff. However, at 70, perhaps it's finally time for me to retire properly. These knees aren't what they used to be. A few knowing chuckles rippled through the room from the housekeeping staff who understood the physical demands of the job. James nodded, having anticipated this response. I understand completely. In that case, I'd like to offer you a different position as our new staff relations advisor. Your experience, wisdom, and intimate knowledge of hotel operations would be invaluable as we work to transform our workplace culture. Margaret's composed expression faltered for the first time, genuine surprise registering on her face. I'd need to think about that. Of course, James agreed. The offer stands whenever you're ready. As the meeting adjourned, Employees filed out with a new energy, conversation buzzing about the unexpected transformation in their normally intimidating boss. Several stopped to speak with Margaret, clasping her hands and expressing delight at seeing her again. Harrison approached James, looking thoughtful. "That was unexpected, sir." "Was it the right call?" James asked, a note of uncharacteristic uncertainty in his voice. "Absolutely," Harrison replied without hesitation. "It won't fix everything overnight, but it's a start, a real one." Later that afternoon, James found himself in a difficult conversation with the hotel's executive chef, who had been notorious for verbally abusing kitchen staff in a manner James had previously overlooked due to the man's culinary talents. "Your methods no longer align with the culture we're building here, Philippe," James explained calmly. "I'm happy to provide references for your technical skills, but if you stay at the Whitmore, the staff intimidation ends today." The chef blustered and threatened to leave, clearly expecting James to back down as he had in the past. Instead, James stood firm. "That's your choice. I hope you'll consider adapting instead, but I'll respect your decision either way." By the end of the week, 3 long-standing issues that staff had been afraid to raise reached James's desk: a malfunctioning service elevator that housekeeping had been struggling with for months, an assistant manager who had been making inappropriate comments to female staff, and an inefficient room cleaning protocol that was causing unnecessary physical strain on housekeepers. James addressed each promptly, earning cautious approval from the staff and open amazement from the executive team, who were still adjusting to his new management style. "I don't understand," Sophia Chen had remarked during a department head meeting. "The quarterly numbers are strong. Why change something that's working?" James considered his response carefully. "Because success isn't just measured in profit margins, Ms. Chen. There are human costs to how we achieve those numbers. Costs I'm no longer willing to impose." Word of the changes at the Whitmore Hotel spread quickly through Boston's hospitality industry. 2 employees who had recently left returned to apply for open positions. A regional restaurant critic noted the more relaxed, genuinely warm service during an anonymous visit. Even Richard Whitmore called, having heard rumors of a dramatic shift in his son's management approach. "Harrison tells me you're turning into a regular people person," Richard remarked, his tone difficult to read. "Should I be concerned?" "About the hotel? No. We're projecting our best quarter in 3 years. James paused. "About me? Maybe. I'm sleeping better, laughing occasionally. Terribly disturbing symptoms." Richard's surprised chuckle was worth the rare attempt at humor. "Your mother, Eleanor, would like to see you. It's been weeks, James." "I know. I needed space," James sighed. "But yes, tell her I'll come for dinner this weekend. There's someone I'd like you both to meet." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. "Margaret Reynolds?" Richard finally asked. "Yes. It's time, don't you think? After 45 years. Another long pause. "I'll speak with your mother. This won't be easy for her." "I know. It's not easy for any of us." James looked out his office window at the Boston skyline. But necessary things rarely are. As he ended the call, James noticed a text from Margaret. "I've thought about your offer. The answer is yes." A smile, genuine, unguarded, still unfamiliar on his face, spread slowly as he typed his response. "Dinner this Sunday with Richard and Eleanor." Her reply came quickly. "Are you sure? Don't want to rush this." James considered the question seriously. Was he rushing this most unusual family reunion? Perhaps. But something told him that they had all waited long enough. "I'm sure," he texted back. "It's time for all of us to move forward together." As he set down his phone, James caught his reflection in the window glass, the same face he'd seen every day of his life, but somehow fundamentally changed. The rigid mask of perfectionism had softened, revealing glimpses of the man he might have been all along had he known the full truth of his origins. He was neither fully a Whitmore nor entirely Margaret's son, but something unique, the product of difficult choices, sacrificial love, and the complicated intersection of privilege and poverty. For the first time in his life, that complexity didn't feel like a weakness to be controlled, but a strength to be embraced. The intercom buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. "Mr. Whitmore," his assistant's voice announced, "your 3 o'clock is here. The new diversity hiring initiative." "Send them in," James replied, turning from the window to face what came next, in his business, in his relationships, and in the ongoing reconstruction of his identity, with newfound openness to possibilities he'd never before considered. The Beacon Hill brownstone looked exactly as it always had, meticulously maintained, tastefully lit, exuding quiet wealth and generations of social standing. Yet as James guided his car into a parking space half a block away, he felt as though he were approaching a stranger's home rather than the place where he'd grown up. "Are you sure about this?" Margaret asked from the passenger seat, smoothing the skirt of her new dress. A simple but elegant navy blue sheath James had insisted on buying for her at Neiman Marcus the day before. "No," James admitted with surprising honesty. "But we're doing it anyway." Margaret smiled at that, a blend of nervousness and determination in her expression. She'd spent the afternoon at a salon, another of James's insistences, and her silver hair was styled in a way that softened her features, making her look less like the housekeeper she'd been, and more like the educated young woman she'd once been, the woman who'd made the most difficult decision of her life in this very neighborhood, more than 4 decades ago. "They may not be happy to see me," Margaret said as they walked toward the house, "especially Eleanor." James considered this. "They've had 45 years with me. They can share an evening." His tone was lighter than his mood. The past 2 weeks since his public apology at the hotel had been a whirlwind of changes, professional and personal. Margaret had accepted the staff relations position, bringing her unique perspective to bear on long-standing issues. They'd begun the cautious work of building a relationship, navigating the emotional complexity of their situation with careful steps forward and occasional retreats when feelings became too raw. James had not yet returned to the Whitmore home. His calls with Richard had been cordial but brief, focused on practical matters. Eleanor had left several voicemails, her voice increasingly concerned as the weeks passed. He'd finally called her 3 days ago, extending the dinner invitation that had brought them to this moment. "James!" Eleanor opened the door herself, as she always did for her son. She moved to embrace him, then hesitated, sensing the shift in their relationship. Her eyes moved to Margaret, recognition and something more complicated flowing across her face. "And Ms. Reynolds, please come in." The formality wasn't lost on James. Not Margaret, they'd met before after all, but Ms. Reynolds establishing distance from the start. Richard waited in the foyer, his posture military straight as always, though James noticed for the first time how age had begun to thin his imposing frame. "Son," he said, offering his hand. Then with a slight nod to Margaret, "Ms. Reynolds, it's been a long time." "Yes," Margaret replied simply. "It has." The 4 of them stood awkwardly until Eleanor gestured toward the dining room. "Dinner is ready. I hope you still enjoy lamb, James." "I do," he confirmed, placing a gentle hand on Margaret's back to guide her forward. The dining room was painfully familiar. The gleaming mahogany table set with the Whitmore family china, crystal glasses catching the light from the chandelier, fresh flowers arranged precisely in the silver centerpiece that had been a wedding gift to Richard's parents. James had eaten thousands of meals at this table, learning proper etiquette under Eleanor's watchful eye, discussing business strategies with Richard, celebrating achievements, planning the future of the Whitmore legacy. Now, he pulled out a chair for Margaret, a gesture that did not go unnoticed by either of his adoptive parents. "You've grown close," Eleanor observed, as the housekeeper served the first course, a chilled asparagus soup that had been James's favorite since childhood. "We're getting to know each other," James replied carefully. "There's a lot of lost time to account for." Richard cleared his throat. "I understand you've offered Ms. Reynolds a position at the hotel after what happened." Margaret spoke before James could respond. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore. James has been very generous, though I suspect it's as much about transforming the hotel's culture as it is about me specifically." James shot her a grateful look. She was giving him space, not forcing the conversation to center immediately on their relationship. "We've heard about the changes," Eleanor said, her spoon moving precisely through her soup. "Quite dramatic, from what Richard's contacts on the board have said." "Long overdue," James replied. "The profit margins were masking serious issues with staff morale and retention. We were succeeding despite our culture, not because of it." Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. "I never found employee satisfaction metrics particularly relevant to business success." "I know," James said, meeting his adoptive father's gaze directly. I learned that approach from you. The tension at the table ratcheted up several degrees. Eleanor set down her spoon with a barely audible clink. Perhaps we could avoid professional disagreements for one evening, she suggested. James nodded, though he knew the professional was inextricably linked to the personal in this case. His management style, his drive for perfection, his emotional distance, all had been shaped by the Whitmore example. All were now being questioned as he reconsidered his identity. The main course arrived, and they ate in uncomfortable silence for several minutes. Finally, Margaret set down her fork and addressed Eleanor directly. "Your home is lovely, Mrs. Whitmore. You've maintained it beautifully over the years." Eleanor seemed surprised by the overture. "Thank you. It's been in Richard's family for 3 generations. I remember you mentioning that when we met all those years ago." Margaret smiled softly. "You were so proud to be bringing a child into this home to continue the family history here." Eleanor's composure wavered slightly. "Yes, we were desperate for a child. For James." James watched the interaction carefully, struck by Margaret's gracious approach. Instead of highlighting the asymmetry of their situations, the wealthy couple who had taken her child, the struggling young woman who had cleaned their son's hotel rooms, she was acknowledging the genuine love Richard and Eleanor had offered him. "I've always wondered," Richard said suddenly, "if you ever regretted your decision." Margaret considered the question thoughtfully. "I regretted the circumstances that made it necessary. I regretted missing his first steps, his first words, watching him grow up." She looked at James with a warmth that made his chest tighten. "But seeing the man he became, knowing he had opportunities I could never have provided, no, I don't regret the decision itself." Eleanor set down her wine glass abruptly. "Yet you took a job at the hotel. You watched him for years without our knowledge. You revealed yourself to him now, despite our agreement." The accusation hung in the air. James began to speak, but Margaret placed a hand on his arm. "You're right to feel betrayed, Mrs. Whitmore. I did break our agreement." Margaret's voice remained steady. "When I applied at the hotel, I told myself I just wanted to see him occasionally from a distance, to know he was well. I never intended to tell him the truth." "What changed?" Richard asked. "He fired me," Margaret said simply, and a small, rueful smile touched her lips. "After 22 years of service, I was suddenly facing the reality that I would never see him again. At 70, I had to ask myself, could I take this secret to my grave? Should I?" Eleanor's perfectly composed face showed a flicker of understanding. "It still wasn't your decision to make." "Mother," James interjected, the word feeling strange in this context. "With respect, it wasn't yours either, or father's. This is my life, my history. I had a right to know." "We protected you," Richard said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone James had heard throughout his childhood. "We gave you stability, certainty, everything a child needs." "And a fundamental lie at the center of my identity," James countered, struggling to keep his voice even. "Do you have any idea what it's been like, discovering at 45 that the story I've been told about myself my entire life isn't true?" Eleanor reached across the table, not quite touching James's hand. "We never meant to hurt you. We believed we were doing what was best." "I know you did," James acknowledged, some of his anger dissipating at the genuine pain in her eyes. "And you were good parents. You gave me every advantage, every opportunity. I'm grateful for that." "But," Richard prompted, sensing the unspoken word. "But I needed the truth too," James finished quietly. "I needed to know where I came from, who I am." Margaret, who had been watching this exchange silently, spoke up. "If I may, I didn't come here tonight to disrupt your family or make claims on James. I came because he asked me to, because he wants to find a way for all of us to be in his life." Eleanor looked skeptical. "And what exactly would that look like, Ms. Reynolds?" "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "This is uncharted territory for all of us, but I do know that James cares deeply for both of you. Nothing about learning my identity has changed that." James felt a surge of gratitude for her understanding, her willingness to acknowledge the bonds that tied him to Richard and Eleanor, despite the complicated truths that had emerged. "She's right," he said. "You're still my parents. That hasn't changed." He took a deep breath. "But Margaret is also my mother. That's the reality we all need to accept now." Richard studied James's face for a long moment. "You've changed these past weeks, not just in how you're running the hotel. Something more fundamental. James nodded. I'm seeing myself differently. My success, my drive for perfection, I always thought they came from being a Whitmore, from living up to your expectations. Now I see parts of myself in Margaret too. Her determination, her resilience, her compassion, Eleanor added quietly, surprising them all. I've heard about your changes at the hotel, James. The focus on staff well-being. That's not something Richard or I taught you. There was an admission in her words, a recognition of something Margaret had given James that they hadn't been able to provide. The acknowledgement hung in the air, a tentative bridge across the chasm that had opened between them. I'd like to propose a toast, James said suddenly, raising his wineglass. To family, in all its complicated, imperfect forms. Richard hesitated, then raised his glass as well. To family. Eleanor and Margaret joined, the crystal clinking softly in the dining room that had seen generations of Whitmore family dinners, but never one quite like this. As the evening progressed, the tension gradually eased. Richard asked Margaret about her new role at the hotel, showing genuine interest in her perspective on the workplace culture. Eleanor shared stories from James's childhood that made him flush with embarrassment, and Margaret listened with hungry attention, soaking up the moments she'd missed. By the time dessert was served, Eleanor's famous crème brûlée, they had reached a fragile truce. Not acceptance, not yet, but the first tentative steps toward a new reality. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor disappeared briefly to her study, returning with a leather-bound album. These are copies, she said, handing it to Margaret, of James growing up. I thought you might like to have them. Margaret's fingers trembled as she accepted the album. Thank you, she whispered, the simple words laden with emotion. This means everything. In the car driving back to Margaret's apartment, James was quiet, processing the evening's emotional complexities. You okay? Margaret asked gently. Yes, he said, surprising himself with the truth of it. It's going to take time, for all of us, but it's a start. 3 weeks later, James stood outside a modest two-bedroom house in Cambridge, keys in hand. The realtor had left hours ago, after finalizing the paperwork that made the property his. Are you sure you want to do this? Margaret asked, standing beside him on the front walk. It's very generous, but it's not charity, James interrupted. It's not guilt either. He searched for the right words. It's 45 years of birthday presents and Christmas gifts I never gave you. It's knowing you'll be comfortable for the rest of your life. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I never expected this. Any of this. I know, James said simply. That's why you deserve it. As they walked through the empty rooms that would soon be filled with Margaret's modest possessions and new furniture James had insisted on purchasing, he reflected on the swift and profound changes of the past 2 months. The Whitmore Hotel was thriving under the new management approach. Profits had dipped slightly as they invested in staff development and better working conditions, but guest satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs. Richard had even visited recently, reluctantly admitting that the changes seemed to be working. His relationship with his adoptive parents remained complicated, but was slowly healing. Eleanor had invited Margaret to tea twice. Awkward affairs at first, but gradually warming as the two women found common ground in their shared affection for James. Most significantly, James himself had changed. The rigid, perfectionistic executive who fired employees for water spots had given way to a more balanced leader who understood that excellence could be achieved through inspiration rather than fear. As Margaret explored her new kitchen, exclaiming over the modern appliances, James leaned against the doorframe, watching her with a smile. The painful revelation that had shattered his identity had ultimately led to something unexpected, a more complete understanding of himself, a reconnection with parts of his humanity he'd long suppressed. Will you come for dinner next week? Margaret asked, turning to him with bright eyes. I want to cook for you in my new kitchen. Nothing fancy, just comfort food. I'd like that, James replied. And maybe Richard and Eleanor could join us. If you're comfortable with that. Margaret's face softened. I think that would be nice, James. A new tradition for our unusual family. As they stood together in the sunlit kitchen, James felt the weight of decades of secrets and missed connections lift slightly. The journey ahead would not be simple, They had years of history to navigate, relationships to redefine, wounds still healing. But for the first time, the future held a promise of wholeness, of integration between the man he'd been raised to be and the man he was discovering himself to be. In finding his mother, James had also begun to find himself. In acknowledging his past, he had opened the door to a more authentic future. And in bringing together the separate pieces of his life, the Whitmore legacy and Margaret's resilient spirit, he was finally becoming not just successful, but truly whole. "Welcome home, Mum," he said. The word still new on his tongue, but feeling right, feeling true. And as Margaret smiled through her tears, James knew that while they couldn't reclaim the years lost, they could build something meaningful from this moment forward, together. Fim de Historia. Thank you so much for following James and Margaret's emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a like on this video. Your support means everything to us. We bring new heartfelt stories like this one every day, so feel free to explore and find your next favorite tale. What did you think about James and Margaret's reconciliation? Were you moved by Eleanor's gesture with the photo album? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. See you tomorrow with another unforgettable story that will touch your heart and soul.